June 6, 1944. 5:00 a.m. The world was quiet. A pale gray dawn crept slowly over the cold waters of the English Channel, brushing the horizon with the faintest trace of light. In a reinforced observation bunker at the Crisbeck Battery on the Normandy coast, Oberleutnant Zurzay, Walter Olmson, lifted his binoculars to the east. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something older, deeper, an instinctive awareness that history itself was about to turn its gaze upon him. Through the heavy lenses, the sea appeared oddly textured, shadows within shadows. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of the light, the restless waves creating illusions as they caught the faint dawn. But as he adjusted the focus, his breath stopped. The line of the horizon was gone. The sea was filled with shapes, thousands of them, black silhouettes against the growing light, some long and slender, others squat and broad. The shapes moved with purpose. They were not drifting. They were coming. The channel, the old moat that for centuries had shielded Europe from invasion, had turned against its guardian. It was no longer water. It was steel. Behind Olmson, the murmurs of his men grew quiet. No one spoke. There was only the rhythmic breathing of soldiers who understood, without words, that everything they had been told, the speeches, the promises, the illusions, had dissolved into that endless gray horizon now marching toward them. At precisely 5:52 a.m., the order came through the radio, clipped and urgent. Feuer frei. Open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55, the first shells from Olmson's battery roared to life. The thunder of his 210mm Czech-made Skoda cannon shattered the morning calm. The concrete walls trembled with each blast, dust sifting from the ceiling like snow. The men cheered instinctively, though their eyes betrayed the truth. They were drops of rain against an approaching storm. Olmson's battery found its first target, the silhouettes of American warships, the cruisers USS Tuscaloosa, USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. Great beasts of steel, gliding through the gray morning, indifferent to the shells that arced toward them. The Germans watched their explosions bloom harmlessly on the water, like pebbles tossed into a lake. At 6:30 a.m., one of their shells struck true. The USS Corey, a U.S. destroyer, shuddered and broke apart, smoke rising as men abandoned ship into the cold sea. For a fleeting moment, there was triumph. Then silence. For every ship that sank, 100 others appeared to replace it. Through his Zeiss rangefinder, Olmson saw not an armada, but a revelation. The mathematics of defeat were coming toward him, an endless equation written in steel and smoke. Across the French coast, similar scenes unfolded. German officers and conscripts stood at their posts, peering into the dawn, struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. They had expected perhaps a few hundred vessels, maybe a few divisions of men. What approached was something no one had imagined: 6,139 vessels, warships, landing craft, transports, and merchant ships, stretching from horizon to horizon. Nearly 200,000 men of 8 allied nations riding that gray tide. It was the beginning of something vast, the opening of a new kind of war. 50 miles inland, at Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Heinz Speidel was already awake. Reports were flooding in. Parachute drops across the Norman countryside, strange gliders landing in the fields, bridges captured before dawn, thousands of men appearing out of the darkness like ghosts. Speidel's commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was not there to see it. He was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for an invasion. Now the telephone screamed with panic, units reporting chaos, communications collapsing under the flood of Allied airborne assaults. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the LXXXIV Corps, listened grimly to the fragmented radio transmissions. A veteran of the Eastern Front, one leg lost at Stalingrad, he understood what others refused to say aloud. This was no diversion. This was the invasion. and it was larger than anything the world had ever seen. Along the coast, searchlights swept across the gray water, revealing the full horror of it. To young soldiers who had never seen the ocean before, it seemed as though the sea itself had turned to metal. One gunner at strong point WN-62, overlooking what would soon be called Omaha Beach, later wrote, "There were no waves, no horizon, only ships, big ships, small ships, flat ones with strange noses. I tried to count them, but gave up after 100. There were thousands." At 5:30 a.m., the Allied naval bombardment began. The sound was unlike anything the German defenders had ever heard. It was not a single thunderclap, not a series of explosions. It was a continuous roar, a vast mechanical heartbeat that shook the earth itself. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors unleashed a torrent of shells. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour, each shell weighing more than half a ton. Olmson felt the first impacts around the battery, deafening blasts that cracked the concrete, tore at the air, and filled the command post with choking dust. He had no time to think, only to observe. He called out range corrections, voice hoarse over the din, watching the fleet through his glasses even as shock waves rippled through his chest. Outside, the world dissolved into smoke and fire. The horizon vanished behind a curtain of explosions. It was the first lesson of the morning. In this new war, destruction was not measured by bravery or tactics, but by tonnage. Before the first Allied soldier even touched the beaches, the guns of the invasion fleet had hurled more than 100,000 tons of explosives at the French coast. Bunkers crumbled, gun emplacements vanished, fields burned. For many German defenders, the bombardment felt eternal. Time stretched, seconds became minutes, minutes became years. When the roar finally eased, silence felt like an alien thing, unnatural and fleeting. Then came the second wave, the sound of engines. Olmson looked up. The sky, once gray, had turned black. Aircraft filled the heavens, thousands of them, so many that their shadows darkened the land below. Allied bombers, fighters, and transports, more than 14,000 sorties flown that day, circled like swarms of locusts. Against them, the Luftwaffe could muster barely 300 planes. In all of France, the once feared German Air Force managed only 319 sorties. For every German aircraft that took to the sky, there were 46 Allied. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, led what would be the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches that morning. 2 planes dove out of the clouds, strafing British positions on Sword Beach before vanishing into the smoke. It was brave. It was futile. In the skies over Normandy, Germany had ceased to exist. Olmson lowered his binoculars. The air trembled. The channel burned. Men ran through the smoke shouting orders, loading shells, dragging cables. Yet in his mind, something quiet was taking shape. He understood, in a way few could articulate, that what he was witnessing was not a battle. It was a revelation. This was no contest between soldiers, no duel of strategy. It was a demonstration, a statement made in steel and fire. In the bunkers along the coast, men of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine began to sense the same truth. Their courage was real, their resolve genuine, but it no longer mattered. Against this tide, courage alone was a relic. They had prepared to fight soldiers. Instead, they were fighting factories. As the first Allied landing craft began to move toward the beaches, gray shapes bobbing on the waves, their ramps closed like jaws. Olmson watched through the periscope. His voice, calm and precise, called coordinates to his gunners. The cannons roared again. Somewhere in the smoke, men screamed, ships burned, and the sea boiled with fragments of steel. But still they came. More landing craft appeared behind the first, then more behind them still, an endless procession of machines and men, an industrial river flowing toward the shore. It was as if the entire ocean had decided to move. By 6:30 a.m., The first American troops hit the beaches at Omaha. The battle for Normandy had begun. Olmson set down his binoculars for a moment, wiping the grit from his eyes. The dawn had fully arrived now, painting the smoke in strange hues of gold and red. He felt, for the briefest instant, an overwhelming sense of smallness. Not fear, but recognition. He was watching something greater than armies, greater than nations. A force born not from hatred or ideology, but from numbers, factories, and the relentless will of a united world. In the quiet between explosions, the young officer whispered to no one, "We cannot stop this." And he was right. What approached the shores of Normandy that morning was not merely an invasion force. It was the physical manifestation of the modern age. The industrial world, made flesh in metal and fire, had come ashore. The defenders of Fortress Europe had no name for it then, but history would. It would call it D-Day. By 6:30, the gray mist that had hidden the Armada began to lift. The first full light of June 6th revealed a scene so vast, so incomprehensible, that even the men who had planned it could scarcely believe it had come to life. Out on the Channel, the invasion fleet spread from horizon to horizon, a living continent of steel and smoke. Battleships belched thunder into the air. Landing craft rolled and dipped on the waves, packed shoulder to shoulder with men. For the German defenders, it was as though the horizon itself had declared war. At strong point WN-62, perched above the stretch of sand soon to be known as Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Gefreiter Heinrich Sau squinted into the rising light. He had grown up on a small farm near Metzingen, far from the sea. He had never seen an ocean before his posting to Normandy. But this was not an ocean. It was movement, machinery, endless and unstoppable. He adjusted his MG-42 machine gun on its iron mount and felt the cold steel beneath his hands. It was the only thing that felt solid. Everything else, sky, sea, earth, was trembling. When the landing craft neared the shallows, the naval bombardment shifted. The great guns of the Allied fleet lifted their aim from the shoreline to the bluffs beyond. The German machine gunners, hidden in concrete nests, looked out through their firing slits and watched in disbelief as the small gray shapes kept coming, lowering their ramps into the surf. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps dropped. Men in khaki and olive surged forward into the freezing water. Some waded, some fell. Some vanished entirely beneath the waves. The sea turned white with spray and red with blood. Omaha Beach was supposed to have been softened by bombardment, but the German defenses stood largely intact. The artillery batteries at Pointe du Hoc still fired. The bunkers above the beach still watched, their guns alive and waiting. The first American wave, young men from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, met a wall of fire. Machine guns opened up with a scream that echoed across the surf. The MG-42 could fire 1-200 rounds a minute, and its operators used every one. Men fell where they stood, their bodies caught in the rising tide. Landing craft became burning coffins, riddled with holes, drifting helplessly backward into the sea. Heinrich Sau, behind his MG-42, kept firing until the barrel smoked. He would later recall that morning with words that trembled with both pride and horror. "I fired until the gun was too hot to touch. I saw them come, fall, and come again. They never stopped. Not once. It was like shooting into a river." From his observation post at Crisbeck Battery, Walter Olmson saw the same scene unfold through his binoculars. The beaches below were crawling with men, tiny moving dots under a cloud of smoke and dust. Every few seconds the earth erupted where naval shells struck. Every few seconds another German position fell silent. He radioed his rangefinders, his voice steady but his words hollow. The mathematics of the morning had already written themselves. For every American soldier who fell, 10 more stepped ashore behind him. For every landing craft destroyed, a dozen more appeared on the horizon. At sea, the great Allied warships fired in rhythm, their salvos like the heartbeat of an industrial giant. The USS Texas thundered again, hurling 14-inch shells into the bluffs. The HMS Warspite, a veteran of 2 world wars, fired from 15 miles offshore with such accuracy that her shells landed within meters of German gun positions. And yet, for all the firepower, for all the planning, Omaha refused to yield easily. By 8:02 a.m., chaos reigned on the beach. Burning landing craft littered the shoreline. Drowned men floated in the shallows. Units were scattered, their officers dead or missing. General Omar Bradley, watching from his flagship Augusta miles offshore, considered the unthinkable: evacuation. But fate and courage intervened. Aboard several American destroyers, USS McCook, USS Doyle, USS Carmack, USS Frankfurt, captains made a decision that would become legend. Disregarding orders and every lesson of naval caution, they turned their ships directly toward the shore. The helmsmen brought the vessels into water so shallow that their keels scraped the sand. At barely 1,000 yards from the beach, within range of small arms fire, the destroyers dropped anchor and swung broadside. Their guns began to speak. From those decks, the view was hell itself: sand, smoke, fire, and the terrible sight of men pinned beneath cliffs. The destroyers' 5-inch guns fired point-blank into the German strongpoints. At such range they could not miss. Concrete bunkers vanished in showers of debris. Machine gun nests were simply erased. German defenders who had held for hours suddenly found their positions exploding around them. It was as though the sea itself had turned against them. One destroyer, the USS Corey, struck a mine and sank in the shallows, her flag still flying. But her crew's sacrifice had already changed the battle. The others stayed, pouring shell after shell into the bluffs until the American infantry could move forward once more. On the cliffs, Heinrich Soe saw the sea erupting with fire. "The destroyers came so close," he wrote later. "I could see the men running on their decks. It was as if they were shooting directly into my soul." By late morning, the tide had turned. The American troops, bloodied but unbroken, began to crawl up the bluffs. Engineers cleared mines, riflemen stormed bunkers, snipers traded fire across the ridges. Step by step, inch by inch, the line moved forward. Olmson, watching from miles away, realized the outcome was already sealed. "They fight like machines," one of his gunners said quietly. "They lose 100, and 100 more take their place." But it was not just numbers. It was a philosophy, a faith in material abundance as a weapon of war. Where the German soldier carried his rifle as his only tool, the American carried not only his weapon but a vast machine behind him: factories, assembly lines, logistics ships, repair depots, and fleets of trucks that would keep moving no matter the cost. By noon, the beaches were secured enough for tanks to land. Amphibious Sherman tanks, some driven, some floating ashore on canvas screens, rumbled up the sand, their treads biting into the soil of France. Behind them came the strange, ingenious contraptions of war: DUKW, amphibious trucks, half boat, half truck, driving straight from water to land; bulldozers pushing aside wreckage; engineers erecting radio towers on the beach itself. To the defenders, these machines seemed to multiply out of thin air. It was not courage alone that had conquered the beach. It was invention. Olmson watched as one landing ship, massive and square-nosed, opened its great iron doors like a beast's jaws. From within rolled tanks, jeeps, and endless crates. Another followed, and another. The beach became a living factory, each machine serving the next. It was then that the German officers began to understand something new. The Allies were not improvising. They were executing a process. Every ship, every vehicle, every crate was part of a system so vast it defied imagination. Even the German engineers, men who had once prided themselves on precision, could only stare in awe. The Allies were not simply fighting a war, they were manufacturing victory in real time. By mid-afternoon, the sound of small arms had replaced the thunder of the great guns. The fighting had moved inland, through hedgerows and fields. The beaches, now behind the lines, were filling with supplies. Thousands of vehicles, stacked ammunition, fuel drums, and men. Endless men. Across Normandy, other beaches told the same story. British and Canadian troops pressed forward at Gold, Juno, and Sword. To the west, the Americans at Utah linked with paratroopers who had seized the causeways. Everywhere, the tide advanced. For the German soldiers who survived the morning, there was only disbelief. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress that had taken 4 years to build, had held for barely 4 hours. As the sun dipped low, the beaches began to take shape as the new front of Europe. Engineers laid down roads of steel planking. Medics tended to rows of wounded under canvas tents. Chaplains offered prayers over makeshift graves. The invasion had become occupation. In the German bunkers, silence settled like dust. Olmson's radio crackled with broken voices, reports from units that no longer existed, orders from commanders already dead. He sat in the dim light of the bunker, his uniform covered in grit, staring out at the horizon. The sea that had brought ruin still shimmered in the fading light. Ships moved slowly, methodically, their silhouettes black against the orange sky. It was beautiful in a terrible way. He thought of the words his naval advisor, Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, had once spoken during an inspection. "We are preparing to fight the last war. They are bringing the next one." Now, Olmson understood. As the night came and the guns fell silent, he realized he had witnessed something far larger than defeat. He had seen the arrival of a new age, an age where courage alone could not withstand the weight of industry, where ingenuity and abundance could drown even the most disciplined army. For the first time, the Atlantic Wall was quiet, and in that silence, as the waves washed over the shattered beach, the truth became clear. Fortress Europe had cracked, not from weakness but from the sheer, relentless mathematics of modern war. By dawn on June 7th, the beaches of Normandy no longer resembled battlefields. They resembled construction sites. The sea had receded, leaving behind not only the wreckage of war but the foundations of something immense. Engineers worked through the night, marking out roads, stacking crates, building command posts under makeshift tarps. Landing craft continued to arrive in perfect sequence, depositing vehicles and men as if following an invisible timetable. For the first time since the invasion began, the German High Command could see the shape of what was unfolding, and it filled them with quiet dread. At the Château de la Roche-Guyon, 30 miles inland, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood beside a large wooden table spread with reconnaissance photos. Cigarette smoke curled upward as his staff officers whispered updates that grew grimmer by the hour. The situation was becoming clear. The Allies had landed 5 divisions across nearly 50 miles of coastline and were now reinforcing at a rate that defied all precedent. Every hour, thousands more men and hundreds more vehicles came ashore. The numbers were no longer military. They were industrial. Rommel tapped the edge of a map with his riding crop. "We are not fighting soldiers," he said quietly. "We are fighting factories." The words hung in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. The German counterattack plan, drawn up long before the invasion, relied on the panzer divisions, armored spearheads that could strike swiftly and throw the invaders back into the sea. But those divisions were scattered, restrained by Hitler's personal command structure. Several were held in reserve near Paris, awaiting direct approval from the Führer himself. That approval never came. Through the morning of June 6th and into the next day, Hitler had refused to believe the Normandy landings were the main attack. Convinced that the true invasion would strike at Calais, he ordered his commanders to hold their armored reserves in place. By the time the truth was undeniable, it was already too late. Rommel knew what that meant. Every hour lost meant another bridgehead secured, another pier erected, another 1,000 tons of supplies unloaded. Meanwhile, on the beaches below, the Allies were performing what the Germans called Wunder der Logistik, a miracle of logistics. Floating harbors, called mulberries, were being assembled piece by piece on the water. Great concrete caissons, each the size of a building, were towed from England and sunk into place to form artificial breakwaters. Within days, the Allies had built fully functioning ports where none had existed before. Through these new harbors, an endless stream of cargo began to flow. Tanks, artillery, rations, fuel, ammunition, trucks, even prefabricated hospitals. To the German observers, it was surreal. They had expected invasion. They had not expected civilization itself to come ashore. At the same time, high above the fields of France, the Luftwaffe was dying in silence. German pilots scrambled from airfields across northern France, their aircraft worn, their fuel scarce, their numbers pitiful. Those who reached the coast found the skies already claimed by swarms of Allied fighters, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, each faster, higher, and more numerous than anything Germany could field. Within 48 hours of D-Day, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force in Normandy. The men on the ground would fight without eyes in the sky. Rommel's radio reports grew desperate. Without air superiority, we are blind. Without fuel, our tanks are statues. Without reserves, our front will collapse. But Berlin answered with silence, or worse, with delusion. The Führer ES headquarters continued to send orders that bore no relation to reality, counterattacks against units that no longer existed, divisions that had been reduced to companies, and objectives already lost. Meanwhile, on the ground, men like Walter Olmson could only watch as their defensive network disintegrated. From his post near Sainte-Mère-Église, he saw columns of Allied vehicles moving inland, jeeps, trucks, tanks, bulldozers, all flowing like a river through the hedgerows. The noise was constant, a metallic heartbeat that never stopped. The German radio bands were filled with broken messages. Units surrounded, bridges destroyed, ammunition gone. The map that once marked the Atlantic Wall had become meaningless. Every hour redrew it anew. For the men still fighting, the sense of order was gone. The war that had once been a chess match of tactics and precision had turned into something vast and impersonal. It was not bravery that decided the outcome now. It was scale. At Carentan, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne linked up with beach forces, closing the gap between Utah and Omaha. At Bayeux, British troops pushed inland under constant artillery fire. The Canadians advanced toward Caen, their Sherman tanks grinding through the narrow roads of the Norman countryside. Everywhere, German units fell back, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion. One infantry captain wrote in his diary, "We are not beaten by men, but by metal. Every hour brings a new storm. We destroy one bridge, and by nightfall they have built another." By June 10th, Rommel ordered all available forces to form a counterattack near Caen. The panzer divisions, though battered, were still formidable. If they could drive a wedge between the Allied beaches, perhaps the invasion could be contained. But the Allies had anticipated this. Their bombers, flying fortresses, Lancasters, and Marauders rained destruction on every road, bridge, and convoy the Germans tried to move. Columns of tanks were obliterated before they ever reached the front. Even at night, the sky glowed with the distant fires of the bombing. The Germans began to realize that their enemy fought not from the battlefield, but from the air, and from that height there was no hiding. For Olmson, stationed in the remnants of an artillery post outside Isigny, the daily rhythm became one of futility. He and his crew would reposition their guns, fire a few rounds, then flee before the inevitable counter-barrage. Every movement brought retaliation. Every spark of resistance drew the gaze of aircraft circling overhead. Once, he recalled, they tried to camouflage their position under netting and branches. By noon, a single P-47 Thunderbolt spotted them. The entire battery was erased in seconds. "The earth itself seemed to explode beneath us," he would write later. "I no longer believed in defense. I believed only in endurance." By mid-June, German morale began to fracture. not from fear of death, but from the slow, crushing realization that the war they were fighting no longer obeyed the rules they had been taught. Their commanders spoke of holding the line, but the line no longer existed. The Allied advance was not a front. It was a flood. Behind that flood stood something no bomb could destroy: the industrial might of nations united. American factories producing 50,000 tanks, 100,000 aircraft, 8 million tons of bombs. British shipyards churning out landing craft faster than they could be sunk. Canadian and Australian workshops sending trucks, shells, and uniforms across oceans. It was not a single army that Germany faced. It was the world. And yet, among the German ranks, there was still courage. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where the fighting turned intimate and brutal, young soldiers on both sides met at distances so close they could hear each other breathe. The grand machinery of war faded into the background, leaving only the human struggle, the desperate will to survive another minute, another meter, another dawn. For those who lived through it, D-Day and the days that followed were not simply battles. They were transformations. The war had changed shape, and so had humanity itself. From the rubble of the Atlantic Wall, a new kind of warfare had emerged, one measured not in heroism, but in horsepower. And as the smoke drifted inland toward the fields and villages that had stood for centuries, men like Olmson could not help but wonder if the age they had known had ended, not with surrender, but with obsolescence. By late June, Normandy was no longer a beachhead. It was a continent reborn in miniature, a new world built on the ruins of the old. The roads from the coast to the interior pulsed with motion: jeeps, trucks, ambulances, bulldozers, tanks, all crawling forward in perfect mechanical rhythm. The once quiet hedgerows of Calvados now echoed with the grind of treads and the clatter of armor. For the Allies, the task was clear: break through the bocage, link the beaches, and drive inland toward Paris. For the Germans, the task was simpler and infinitely harder: stop them, no matter the cost. In theory, the German Seventh Army still existed. On paper, it held more than 150,000 men. In reality, it was a patchwork of exhausted units, shattered regiments, and isolated companies fighting without air cover or supply. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, now commanded ghosts. He spent his days in a staff car, moving from one threatened sector to the next, urging officers to hold. He had seen defeat before. In Africa, he had fought against overwhelming odds. But never like this. The enemy in Normandy fought with a precision and abundance that defied imagination. Every hedgerow, every farm, every village had to be taken twice, once by infantry and once by bulldozers. Tanks crawled through fields where each fence line was a fortress. German machine gunners used the thick earth banks for cover, waiting until the Allies came within meters before opening fire. The fighting was intimate, brutal, and slow. For the Americans in the West, progress was measured in yards. For the Germans, defense meant extinction. Walter Olmson, now operating a mobile observation team near St. Lo, kept his notes in a small, mud-stained journal. Each morning, he wrote, "I wake to the same sounds: the engines, the guns, the distant hum of bombers. I cannot remember silence." At night, the skies glowed orange as Allied aircraft bombed road junctions and railways. The Germans tried to move supplies under darkness, but even then the droning of engines above told them they were seen, tracked, and hunted. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a whisper. A few scattered sorties, quickly intercepted. The skies belonged to others. On July 17th, Rommel was returning from the front when his car was strafed by British aircraft. The windshield shattered, and he was thrown from the vehicle, suffering a fractured skull. His staff rushed him to a hospital. For the German army in the West, his absence was more than physical. It was symbolic. The last commander who still understood the war's reality was gone. Command now passed to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who inherited not a front, but a disaster. By late July, the Allies had launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. Before dawn, 3,000 bombers filled the sky above St. Lo. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything seen before in Europe, a wall of fire and steel stretching for miles. When it was over, entire German divisions had ceased to exist. Tanks were overturned like toys. Men wandered the fields in shock, their ears bleeding from the concussions. One German sergeant described it simply, "The earth opened and swallowed us." Through the smoking fields came the American armor, Patton's Third Army, newly arrived, moving with the confidence of a force unleashed. The German lines broke open. For the first time since the landings, the Allies were no longer crawling. They were running. Columns of Sherman tanks rolled forward, cutting through villages and farmlands that had been battlefields for weeks. The enemy, once invisible among the hedgerows, was now retreating in the open. Olmson saw the retreat begin. It was not a rout in the traditional sense. It was something slower, heavier, more inevitable. Trucks overloaded with wounded men, horses pulling broken guns, columns of infantry marching without orders, all drifting east, away from the sea that had brought their ruin. He wrote, "The road to Falaise is no longer a road. It is a wound." By early August, that wound would close. The Allies had advanced so rapidly that they began to encircle the German 7th Army and Panzer Group Eberbach in a pocket between Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois. Tens of thousands of German troops found themselves trapped. A vast army without air, without fuel, without escape. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. Convoys collided in the dust, artillery pieces abandoned, soldiers digging trenches in the ditches. The stench of burning fuel and flesh hung in the air. Allied aircraft circled overhead like patient predators. Whenever movement stirred below, rockets fell. Each explosion sent plumes of smoke rising through the August haze. Those who survived would later say it was not a battle, but an annihilation. One British pilot described it as shooting fish in a barrel. But most felt no triumph, only pity. The fields of Normandy were littered with the remnants of an army that had once ruled a continent. On August 20th, the pocket finally closed. Nearly 50,000 Germans were captured. Another 10,000 lay dead among the wreckage of tanks and wagons. For miles, the roads were blocked with bodies and machines, fused together in the heat of explosions. Walter Olmson was among the few who escaped before the trap sealed. His last entry from Normandy was brief and resigned. "We are leaving France behind. It is no longer ours. Perhaps it never was." The survivors withdrew across the Seine, pursued relentlessly by Allied bombers. The once mighty German army of the West was now a shadow of itself. Behind them, the countryside of Normandy lay in ruins. Towns like St. Lo and Caen, once picturesque, were flattened into gray wastelands. The civilians who emerged from cellars found their homes gone, their fields cratered, their livestock scattered. Yet, amid that desolation, there was also rebirth. French resistance fighters joined the advancing Allied columns, waving tricolor flags pulled from hiding. Children ran alongside tanks, shouting words of freedom they had not dared to speak in 4 years. The road to Paris was open, and as the Allied forces surged forward, the Germans who had survived could no longer imagine victory. Their thoughts turned inward, to families, to homes, to the simple wish to see another day. From Berlin came new orders: defend, counterattack, fight to the last. But even the radio operators delivering them no longer believed. For the first time, the German soldier understood that his nation's destiny was no longer written by courage or sacrifice. It was written by numbers, by machines, by factories across an ocean that had outbuilt the Reich 100-fold. Rommel, recovering from his wounds in Germany, received reports from the front. He read them in silence, then set them down without comment. He knew what they meant. The Western Front was finished. In August's final days, the Allies crossed the Seine. Paris rose in revolt. German columns fled eastward in disarray. The tide that had begun on the beaches now washed across the heart of Europe. For those who had stood upon the Atlantic wall and believed it invincible, there was a bitter understanding. Walls made of concrete could not stop the future. The war was not yet over, but the outcome had already been decided. And in the quiet that followed the roar of retreat, the world seemed to pause. The dust settled. The smoke thinned. The guns grew distant. Above the ruins of France, the gulls returned to the shore. The sea was calm again. But beneath that calm lay the echo of what the men of both sides had seen. The day when the old world ended, and the industrial age claimed its final victory. By late August 1944, Normandy was no longer a battlefield. It had become a graveyard of tanks, aircraft, and ambition. The thunder that had once shaken its fields had faded, replaced by the quiet hiss of wind through the broken hedgerows. For those who survived, the silence was almost unbearable. The sea that had carried the Allied armada now glittered peacefully under autumn light, as if the storm had never passed. But beneath the calm lay a truth that both sides understood. The war had changed, and with it, the world. Walter Olmson, the German observer who had once charted the invasion from Crisbeck Battery, returned to the ruins months later. The bunkers lay split open, the guns shattered, the steel rusting in the salt air. He listened to the sea and thought of that morning when the horizon had turned black with ships. He realized then that Germany had not been defeated by courage or tactics, but by capacity, by the ability to imagine, organize, and produce on a scale beyond comprehension. He wrote years later, "It was not that they had more soldiers, it was that they had turned their factories into armies." In Berlin, the remnants of the Reich's high command clung to reports and promises. They spoke of new weapons, jet aircraft, rockets, miracle tanks, as if technology could reverse time. But the math was already written. In 1944, American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft, 10 times the output of Germany. For every tank lost in Normandy, 10 more rolled off Allied assembly lines. The war had become a calculation, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. General Franz Halder would later admit, "We were not defeated in the field. We were defeated in the factory." For the Allies, Normandy was both triumph and tragedy. Victory had been purchased in blood. 209,000 Allied casualties, 37,000 dead. Entire towns had been flattened to free them. Caen lay in ruins, its cathedral standing alone amid the ashes. A British chaplain wrote in his diary, "We are told this is victory, but it feels like loss, measured in stone and silence." Yet, amid the devastation, liberation had come. Villagers emerged from cellars holding faded flags. Children waved at passing tanks. The cost was immense, but the idea was greater, that tyranny could be undone not by words, but by will made real through unity and production. By September, the Allies were crossing the Seine. Paris was free. The German armies retreated east, leaving behind the wreckage of a broken dream. Field Marshal Rommel, once the desert hero, lay wounded and disillusioned. He had warned Hitler that the war in the West was lost, that the enemy's material power was beyond imagining. In October, he was forced to take poison, condemned by the regime he had served. His aide, Hans Speidel, survived. Years later, he would serve in NATO, remarking softly, "In Normandy, I saw what unity could accomplish. I never forgot it." For the men of both sides, the memory of those beaches never faded. American soldiers remembered the smell of wet sand and cordite, the sight of comrades falling in the surf. German gunners remembered the endless roar of engines and the hopelessness of firing into an ocean of steel. One Luftwaffe officer later confessed, "I thought we were the masters of war, but on that day I realized war itself had outgrown us." After the war, at a quiet meeting in Bonn, Surviving German officers gathered to discuss Normandy. They spoke not as enemies, but as men humbled by history. General Gunther Blumentritt summed it up. In Normandy, we learned that courage and training are not enough. The war belonged to those who could build, not those who could boast. No one argued. There was only silence, the silence of understanding. 4 decades later, Walter Olmson returned once more to Crisbeck. He stood among the ruins of his old command post, watching the tide roll in. Beside him stood veterans from both sides, British, American, German, their uniforms replaced by windbreakers and caps. Olmson spoke quietly, as if to the sea. That morning, I watched 7,000 ships appear out of the mist. I fired my guns at them and realized it made no difference. For every ship I struck, 100 more followed. It was not an army, it was a civilization. They fought with machines we could not imagine, supplied by factories we could not stop. In that moment, I saw the future. The camera drifts out over the beach. The waves rise and fall, gentle and eternal. D-Day was not only the turning of a war, it was the turning of an age. The German officers who watched that armada understood that willpower alone could not win in a world of industry and cooperation. They saw, in that sea of ships, the embodiment of a new kind of strength, the strength to build together. The tide retreats, carrying with it the echoes of guns and the ghosts of men. The sea is calm again, as it was before history interrupted it. And on the shore of Normandy, beneath the quiet sky, remains the enduring truth of June 6, 1944, that the true victory was not only the liberation of Europe, but the realization that humanity's greatest power lies not in destruction, but in creation.